Hey everybody, my name is Damon Knight, and as always, welcome to my channel and our series on a complete noob's guide to astrophotography. If you haven't already, I do strongly recommend you go back and check out the previous videos in the series. A lot of good, important information there that helps lay a lot of the groundwork. In today's video, we're going to be continuing our discussion of deep space astrophotography. In the last video, we went over a lot of the hows and whys, and in this video, we're going to talk a bit more about the equipment involved, specifically telescopes. Now, I could probably spend several videos just talking about telescopes, so to try to keep things relatively short, we're going to focus on two very important areas for deep space astrophotography, which is focal length and focal ratio. It's worth noting that neither of these directly impacts the image quality, which is a whole other complicated topic about like glass and things like that we're not going to get into today. Now, I've mentioned before that focal length is basically how much magnification you get. Different objects in the sky are different sizes and distances away from us, which means that they will need different focal lengths. More focal length also generally means more money and probably a slower focal ratio as well. And I promise we'll get to why that's important in a little while. I'm also going to note that for this video, I'm going to generally be talking about refractor telescopes instead of reflectors whenever I'm talking about like size or weight. So please bear that in mind, right? Reflectors are generally going to be bigger and heavier. Now, a short focal length is going to be pretty similar to what you'd get from a decent zoom camera lens or a small telescope. This is going to be anything with a focal length less than like 250 or 300 millimeters. And these are good for very large nebula, like the North American Nebula, the California Nebula, or the Andromeda Galaxy. You can also get awesome pictures of like groups of nearby nebula. These are fantastic for folks just getting started, since these telescopes are generally easier to use because they don't really require super accurate tracking. And we'll talk about tracking in a future video, but for cost purposes, this is a good thing. They're pretty small and they usually only weigh a couple of pounds. A medium focal length is going to be more in the like 350 to 600 millimeter focal length. Again, right, obviously, none of these are like hard and fast rules. It's just kind of rough numbers. These aren't going to be like too big or bulky, but you probably wouldn't want to try to just walk around with one like you would a camera lens. These could be great for getting some detailed shots of some more mid-sized nebula, like the Heart Nebula or the Rosette Nebula, and some galaxies that are a bit smaller and further out, like the Pinwheel Galaxy or Bode's Galaxy. You're going to start to want some more accurate tracking with these, and the weight capacity of your mount is going to start to be a bit more of a consideration. And these are going to be, at least 5 pounds or more generally in weight. Once you get to maybe like 650 millimeters or more, you're getting into kind of the longer focal lengths. Now, these telescopes are gonna start to get pretty darn big and bulky, especially once you start getting up, around 8 or 900 millimeters or more. But now you're gonna start to be able to image some of the smaller nebula and galaxies like Monkey Head or the Cocoon Nebula, or like the Triangulum Galaxy or the Whale and Hockey Stick galaxies. you're gonna really start to really need some accurate guiding and tracking and a beefier mount, right? These can weigh 10, 15, 20 pounds or more, right? You can start getting into even 30-pound scopes at this point. Now, let's be clear, this is not just a case of bigger is better, right? There's definitely such a thing as too much focal length. It all really depends on what objects you want to take pictures of. That isn't to say that you can't take pictures of those bigger, closer objects with ultra high focal lengths. You totally can. But then you're doing what's called like mosaics, where you're taking pictures of individual regions or putting them together, or you're just taking pictures of just small parts of those objects and going with those. But on the flip side, a very short focal length won't be able to get you super detailed pictures of those tiny objects, right? You're just going to wind up with little dots. It's all kind of about the trade-offs and knowing what you want to do and can accomplish and what the rest of your equipment can support. So now, let's talk about focal ratio, which is basically how fast your telescope is. If you have experience in traditional photography, this is the same as an f-stop. It is a ratio of the focal length to the size of the aperture of the telescope. It's basically how much light you are getting in. Why is this important? Well, I mentioned in the previous video, you generally want to capture as much light as possible for deep space objects since they tend to be so dim, and that's why we take all these images and stack them together. The faster your focal ratio is, the less imaging time you need to collect the same amount of light. All right, so now you have a rough idea of what focal ratio is. We can talk about some specifics. Focal ratios are generally presented in the form of f slash and a number, like f2, f4, f7, and so on. The smaller the number is, the faster it is. It's easy, right? And mostly, yes, it is. But there are, of course, a few caveats. Bigger numbers aren't just slower, they're a lot slower. For example, you might think that like an f2 scope is twice as fast as an f4 scope, but it's actually 4 times as fast. Just crazy. And so, right, that just gets worse and worse as you get into those bigger numbers, like f7, f8, f10. As I mentioned earlier in the video too, right, the more focal length you have, generally, the slower your telescope is going to be, unless it is a very wide around scope, really, really big aperture. Now, personally, for deep space astrophotography, I wouldn't recommend going any slower than about f8. That doesn't say you can't do it with f10 or slower. I've seen some great images from folks, but the imaging time needed just starts getting really, really high, especially the dimmer the object is. Telescopes at those sorts of speeds are really intended more for planetary astrophotography. You can get things like reducers, which will sacrifice some of the focal length to improve the focal ratio. I use one myself. My scope is natively f10, but I use a reducer to get it down to f7. But that's a whole other topic for another video. On the flip side, once you start getting down, f2, you can run into needing like specialized filters just because of how fast they are. Between f2 and f8 is really probably the sweet spot for most deep space use, especially if you're just getting started. And of course, there's some other factors to consider around like your camera size and your pixel size and things like that. But that's, again, outside of the scope of this video. That'll get saved for a kind of more of a camera specifics video. hopefully I haven't completely melted your brain with all of this information. I know it's quite a bit, but now you should at least know enough to start telescope window shopping. So I think this is probably a good stopping point for today's video. I'm not sure yet what the next topic will be, so please stay tuned, keep an eye out. Um, Hopefully, I'll get one out relatively soon. Um, Thank you, of course, as always, for watching, and I guess that's it for today. I'll see you all again next video.